Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Cott, SVP of Programming at The Hill. Thank you to everyone for joining us online and in the room for our event today, Veterans Voices. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Airlines for America, for their support of this important event. We are here today to amplify veterans' voices from across the country, highlighting their transitions from military life to the workplace environment, their accomplishments and struggles, and their real-life stories as a tribute to their service. As the veteran population has been declining steadily over the years, the Hill's Veterans Voices show salutes the veterans across the country and will dive into such important topics. How can we better value our veterans at home and at work? What more can policymakers in Washington do to improve the lives who have served? How can the private sector and communities across the country create pathways to opportunities for veterans and their families? Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. If you're with us here in the room, please turn your phones onto silent for the duration of our program, but please join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on X, Facebook, and Instagram at The Hill Events using the hashtag veterans. And with that, I am delighted to begin our program with our first interview. Please welcome the Hill's Editor-in-Chief, Bob Cusack, and Congressman Seth Moulton, member of the Armed Services Committee. Good morning.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Congressman, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Let's start off with the obvious question. There was an election last week. What happened? And where do Democrats go from here?
Well, we got wiped out, is what happened across the board. And I think it is an opportunity for Democrats to figure out how to reconnect with a lot of American voters that we've clearly lost touch with and chart a new path forward. We can't keep doing the same thing we're doing. We've got to have a new strategy. And I've been trying to foster that conversation over the past few days in the party. But there's got to be a lot of soul searching, and there's got to be a lot of looking in the mirror and just honestly saying, where have we lost touch?
What do you think a Trump administration means for veterans?
Well, I think it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag from what little we know right now.
Okay.
I've worked very closely with Mike Waltz, the new national security advisor. He and I have traveled together to the Pacific to try to understand the China challenge better, for example. I think that he's a trustworthy partner. Now, to be fair, he's really, catered to, which is a polite way to put it, Trump over the past couple years. It seems to have paid off for him. But I do think that fundamentally he's smart, he's thoughtful, he's relatively bipartisan. I've been able to work with him on a variety of issues, and that's exactly the kind of person you need in that position. He's a veteran. He was in the National Guard, and that gives him a perspective on veterans issues. Pete Hegseth was just announced last night as the new Secretary of Defense. I think he's going to try very hard to politicize the military. That's been his MO at Fox News and in his variety of positions since he got out of the National Guard as well. And so that's not going to be a good influence, but he does care about veterans. Clearly, Pete is someone who cares about veterans. But you put those two in contrast with the draft dodger who's our new commander-in-chief, who clearly doesn't respect veterans, as his senior military advisors have told us unequivocally. And some Republicans like to dismiss that. No, that's just the facts. He doesn't respect veterans. He doesn't respect especially wounded veterans. He clearly thought it was better for him to stay home so that someone else could go to Vietnam in his place. So at a fundamental level, the commander-in-chief does not respect veterans, but he's going to be surrounded by some advisors who do.
What do you hear from veterans across the country? What are their biggest challenges and needs?
Well, I think that it's amazing to look at some broad statistics that veterans are disproportionately Fortune 500 CEOs. They have average lifetime earnings that are higher than non-veterans. They're more civically involved. They're leaders in our community. Veterans are also disproportionately homeless. They have higher suicide rates. They have higher drug addiction rates. So how do you get this bifurcation, right? You have many veterans who are extraordinarily successful and some who are literally on the streets. Well, I think a lot of that just comes back to the transition. And as a Marine veteran myself, getting out after 4 tours in the infantry in Iraq, I had some amazing opportunities. I was able to go to grad school, and yet I still found the transition very difficult. So I think a lot of veteran issues come back to whether you can navigate that transition successfully or not. Because if you navigate it successfully, then you take your leadership experience leading in literally the most difficult environment on earth and turn it into success back home. But if you don't navigate that transition successfully, if you don't deal with issues like post-traumatic stress, which I had to deal with, if you don't figure out how to turn your education benefits into a way to transition into the civilian life, if you come back to broken families and you just can't sort of get out of that spiral, then you might literally end up addicted to drugs and on the street. And so my veterans work in Congress has been focused on that initial point. We need to deal with veterans homelessness, but I'd rather deal with it by just focusing on the transition that leads to that rather than dealing just exclusively with the problem itself. Does that make sense?
It does, but I got to follow up on that. As far as your transition, what was the most difficult part of it? You mentioned you have PTSD. I want to talk a little bit about that. Was that part of it?
I call it post-traumatic stress because as a Marine that I served with said to me, and we served in the same platoon, Seth, after what we went through, it would be a disorder if you weren't affected by it.
Okay.
And so I've done a lot of work on veterans' mental health after I became the first sitting member of Congress to talk openly about my own mental health issues, which has been like a death sentence in politics for a long time, even though we know that some of our most famous American politicians in history had mental health issues. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, maybe the best president ever, struggled with lifelong depression. And if you look at what President H.W. Bush, President Kennedy have said about their experience in World War II, they probably were dealing with some symptoms of post-traumatic stress as I was. Now, I had a relatively minor case, which for a long time made me dismiss it and say, I don't need help, I'm fine. Look at these guys who, can't even get out of bed in the morning. They're the ones who really need the attention. And frankly, that was wrong. That was wrong. And it took talking to fellow veterans to recognize that I had some symptoms and it would be better to deal with them, which I did. But the long story here is that was before I got to Congress. And when I ran, I kept it completely secret. I mean, no one on my team, maybe one person, knew that I even dealt with a mental health issue because this was like the biggest skeleton in my closet. Right? Because I thought it would completely derail my chances of even just getting elected to Congress. But that's not leadership by example. And the Marines preach leadership by example. So after a few years, I said, nope, I need to talk about this because it might help other people. I didn't know if my career in politics might end that night. But instead, it's kind of launched me on this mental health crusade, and I co-authored the bill to establish 988, now the National Mental Health Hotline, with a fellow veteran, an Air Force veteran from Utah, Chris Stewart, incidentally, a world record-holding Air Force veteran. I think he flew around the planet faster than anyone else. I do not hold any world records in the Marine Corps, but we were able to get this really significant piece of legislation passed that's helping a lot of veterans and a lot of ordinary Americans who are dealing with mental health issues across the country.
And I want to talk about 988 because I think that's one of the best things I've ever seen government do. But tell us about the veteran component of that. A veteran calls that line, which it's obviously a lot more memorable than whatever the old line was.
Right.
What happens?
Well, you're going to get, I think it's literally you press 1, you get connected directly to the Veterans Crisis Line, which has trained operators, trained people who understand how to deal with these issues, but can speak specifically to veterans. And actually, one of the features of 988 is we're really trying hard to get these specific options open for a variety of people. So, if you call because you're getting insulted at school because you're LGBTQ, you're going to talk to someone who can speak specifically to those issues. If you call and you speak Spanish, you're going to speak specifically to someone who speaks Spanish. In fact, we're dramatically expanding the language components. So I don't remember how many languages we're up to now, but we're trying to make sure that no matter what language you speak, you can talk to someone in your native language. So there are a lot of ways that we're making the line more specific, but really the first way was to make sure that veterans could get help from someone who's trained to speak to veterans' issues.
Going back to your mental health struggles, and so many have them, whether they're veterans or not. Do you think that stigma has changed, maybe post-COVID?
Absolutely. I don't know what changed it, but I mean, I shared this story before COVID, And like I said, I thought it could end my political career. Instead, people were really receptive. And I've had people come up to me all over the country and say, Seth, thank you for sharing your story because it's helped me share mine. And maybe the most shocking piece for me was, I mean, it's amazing. You go to like a VFW, I remember in Las Vegas, and a Vietnam veteran came up to me and said, I have struggled with post-traumatic stress since Vietnam, and I've never talked about it. I'm going to go get help now. I'm going to go talk to the VA. But I also had people on my own staff who I never knew had mental health issues who opened up and said, actually, you know, I've got this too. So the best part about talking about my own story is it's helped enable other people to talk about theirs. And that's really how we end the stigma. Because you soon realize that everybody is connected to someone who has a mental health issue very intimately. It's so widespread. And some of them serious, some of them more minor. But whether you have it yourself or a close family member or a friend has a mental health issue, it's something we should be able to talk about openly.
So the reaction completely surprised you?
Honestly, it did. I thought it was the right thing to do, but I thought there would be way more backlash, way more damage control that I would have to do. And instead, it's really been extraordinarily positive. I mean, it's still a stigma, though, right? You know, if I told you that after this I've got to go for my annual physical, no one would say, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with you, Seth?" Right. But if I told you that I was going to a mental health appointment after this, you might be thinking, you know, is everything okay? So we've got a long way to go to get to the point where mental health is the same as physical health. We do preventative care. We just have regular checkups to make sure you don't have any issues, regardless of whether you actually seem to be sick. I mean, that's where we need to get to, and we have a bit of a roadmap to do so. But there still is a stigma in America today. I think it's important to acknowledge that. We've come a long way, but we haven't solved the problem.
My brother, years ago, did a documentary about someone who came back from Iraq, a veteran, and then, you know, fell through the cracks, became homeless. And also one of the issues that film highlighted was just loneliness. You say you talked to former colleagues. How can veterans watching this, you know, what are the programs that you think are the most effective, and how do they do it? Because it's so daunting, especially when you're dealing with an issue like healthcare, VA healthcare. I mean, a healthcare system, no matter what the system is, so complicated.
It's a really good point, because I think a lot of people think of post-traumatic stress as only the most extreme cases, right? Well, where you're addicted to drugs, you can't get out of bed in the morning, or whatever the symptoms might be. But I found, has anyone read Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe? A few people. This is a book about transitioning from war, but it spoke very personally to me because it talked about mental health issues that were more about just what it means to not have the camaraderie of your team, what it means to come back to a life that's so mundane and inconsequential compared to the work that you were doing overseas. And that kind of transition, including just loneliness. You know, you're used to being a part of this amazing team, doing some of the most difficult work in the world, and now you're home. And you know, I was going to grad school. That was a great opportunity, but it felt pretty meaningless, to be honest. You know, sitting in the back of a classroom at Harvard, great opportunity, but God, compared to what my friends were still doing in Iraq or Afghanistan, this is like this doesn't mean much. And so there are a lot of different ways in which the transition can be difficult. But the best part about talking about these issues as veterans is veterans can also, I think, set an example for the rest of the country. In fact, even we mentioned preventative mental health care. Some of our elite special forces are doing mindfulness training right now, which is a form of sort of preventative mental health care, because it helps them do their jobs better. And that's a great example to set for everybody else.
As far as last question, it's a big loaded question, but over the next 10 years,
we like loaded questions.
Where, you know, I think that the treatment of veterans' mental health has come a long way over the last decade, but what's the next decade's challenges, especially with military challenges across the globe? I mean, honestly, President Trump was elected because of domestic issues, but he's got a lot of foreign policy challenges. And
a lot of foreign policy.
Hopefully not more wars, but some conflicts, potentially.
Yeah, and some things that could turn into wars pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, Xi Jinping could invade Taiwan and start World War III in the Pacific. Ukraine could go nuclear, or Putin could get the message that he's going to get away with Ukraine and therefore go after a NATO country next, which means U.S. boots on the ground. I mean, it is a dangerous world. I think we've got to be honest about that. But back home with veterans care, and specifically on mental health, there's a couple things we need to do. 988 dramatically increased access to emergency care because now everyone knows. You wake up in the middle of the night, you don't need to find a phone book. If you or a loved one has a mental health crisis, you just dial 988. Mm-hmm. But then what happens next? Because it turns out that after you get that intervention, which by the way is saving thousands of lives a month, by some estimates, 95% of the calls received to 988 result in a life-saving intervention. So think about that. Think about how many people are calling 988 and it's literally saving their lives. But you don't get cured like that, right?
Right.
You know, you don't fix a broken ankle just by getting a Band-Aid. So what needs to happen next is you have to have follow-on care with a therapist. It's very hard to find mental health appointments. We don't have enough providers. Mm-hmm. I've also worked on increasing mental health access to active duty members to try to head off some of these problems before they become veterans. We need to do more to make sure that service is accessible when you're on active duty, no matter where you are in the world. And ultimately, we've got to get to this point where it is so normalized that we're doing preventative mental health care and not just responsive or reactive mental health care. In the same way you go to a physical and might say, you know, you're fine, but you could lose a little weight. You know, are you exercising enough? Mm-hmm. That's where we need to get with mental health care. And that ultimately will make the veterans community stronger and safer. It'll make our active duty forces more effective. And I think we'll be a stronger nation.
We've run out of time. Please thank the Congressman for joining us this morning. Hey, thanks so much. Well done, thanks.